The silk veil felt like a shroud of lead as the bedroom door clicked shut, sealing Thandeka into the lion's den. She knelt on the edge of the sprawling bed, the air thick with the synthetic sweetness of her sister's stolen perfume, a desperate olfactory mask to hide the scent of her own fear. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a South African drum echoing in the sterile silence of the Seoul penthouse. She heard the rhythmic, heavy footsteps of Kang Seo-jin before she saw him, a quiet storm approaching with the terrifying discipline of a man who never wastes a movement. When his hand finally reached out to lift the lace, the movement was not hurried, but clinical. He pulled back the fabric to reveal not the trembling girl he had purchased, but a woman with eyes like burning embers and curves that refused to be diminished by a submissive pose. The silence that followed was suffocating. Seo-jin did not shout. He did not strike. He simply stood there, his presence a dark, overwhelming weight that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. His sharp eyes tracked the line of her jaw, the pulse jumping in her neck, and the way her shoulders refused to slump despite her trembling hands. "You are a lie," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the hair on her arms stand up. "I am the payment," Thandeka countered, her voice fracturing but holding its ground. "My sister is gone. You have me instead." Seo-jin stepped closer, his body a weapon of sculpted muscle and hidden ink, caging her in with his shadow. He leaned down until his breath stirred the curls at her temple, smelling the deception and the raw, human heat of her. "I don't accept substitutes, Thandeka Ndlovu," he whispered, her name sounding like a sentence on his tongue. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was a violation of her composure. He looked at her, as if she were a fascinating piece of glass he was deciding whether to polish or shatter. "The debt was for a girl who would break," he murmured. "But you came here to fight." He turned his back to her, the massive tattoo of the syndicate rippling across his skin, a map of blood and loyalty that served as a warning. "Sleep. Tomorrow, I decide if you are worth the trouble of your own lie." Morning in the penthouse was not heralded by the sun, but by the clinical hum of automated blinds sliding upward to reveal a Seoul skyline that looked like a motherboard of glass and steel. Thandeka awoke alone, the vast bed a desert of silk that had not been disturbed by the weight of a second body. The silence of the high-rise was oppressive. It was a vacuum that seemed to swallow the sound of her own breathing. She dressed in the clothes provided, garments that were undeniably expensive but lacked the vibrant colors of home, and stepped out to explore the boundaries of her captivity. The penthouse was a marvel of modern isolation. Every surface was polished marble or cold chrome, reflecting her image back at her like a distorted ghost. There were no family photographs, no stray books, and no evidence of a life lived with joy. It was a mausoleum for a man who was still breathing. As she wandered the long, sterile hallways, she felt the invisible eyes of the syndicate upon her. Motion sensors clicked softly, and the hum of security cameras followed her movement, reminding her that in this house, privacy was a myth, and surveillance was the only form of intimacy. She found the kitchen, a space so immaculate it felt like a showroom. She ran her hand over the cold countertop, missing the communal heat of her grandmother's kitchen in South Africa, where the air was always thick with the scent of spices and laughter. Here, everything was tucked away behind seamless cabinetry, hidden and controlled. In a corner of the living area, she discovered a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. From this height, the people below looked like ants, oblivious to the war of wills happening 70 stories above them. Thandeka pressed her forehead against the glass. She was a bird in a gilded cage, but she refused to be a silent one. She began to hum a low, rhythmic song from her childhood, the vibrations thrumming in her chest. It was a small, defiant act of colonization. She was pouring her soul into his vacuum, forcing the sterile air to carry the weight of her heritage. She was no longer just a substitute. She was a presence that the high-rise, and the man who owned it, could no longer ignore. The memory of the dust in KwaZulu-Natal felt more real than the cold marble of Seoul. It was a thick, red heat that clung to the skin, a sharp contrast to the sterile air that now surrounded Thandeka. She closed her eyes and saw the flickering light of their small home, the shadows stretching long as her younger sister, Lindiwe, sat huddled on the floor, her face a mask of absolute terror. Lindiwe had always been the dreamer, the one who chased the horizon, but she had chased it too far into the neon-lit gambling dens, where the Korean syndicate's reach was long, and their patience was short. The loan sharks hadn't shouted. They had spoken with the terrifying calmness of accountants. Lindiwe had gambled away more than just money. She had collateralized her future. The debt was a blood bond that could only be settled by the chairman-in-waiting's demand for a guest to return to Korea, a euphemism for a body to be owned. Thandeka remembered the way the ink looked on the contract, dark and final, like a vein opened on the page. She had watched her sister's hands shake so violently she couldn't hold a pen, the girl's bright spirit already beginning to wither under the weight of the inevitable. "I will go," Thandeka had whispered, the words cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Her grandmother's eyes had filled with a sudden, sharp grief, but Thandeka had only looked at her sister. She saw the life Lindiwe still had to live, the innocence that deserved to be preserved. Thandeka was the eldest, the shield, the one whose curves were built for endurance, and whose heart was forged in the fire of responsibility. The swap had been a frantic, whispered affair in the shadows of the airport, a frantic exchange of passports and perfumes. As Thandeka watched Lindiwe disappear into the safety of the crowd, she felt the anchor of her old life snap. She had traded her sunshine for this metallic sky, her name for a debt, and her freedom for a sister's breath. In the silence of the high-rise, she touched the silk of her dress and realized that in South Africa, she had been a protector. Here, she was a price. But as she opened her eyes to the Seoul skyline, the terror was gone, replaced by the cold, hard resolve of a woman who knew exactly what her life was worth. The following evening, Thandeka decided that the suffocating silence of the penthouse was a ghost she would no longer entertain. If she was to be a prisoner, she would not be a quiet one. She invaded the sterile sanctuary of the kitchen, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator that had likely never been touched by human hands. The sharp, vibrant scent of garlic, ginger, and peri-peri began to rise, a fragrant rebellion against the metallic scent of the air conditioning. She moved with a deliberate, rhythmic grace, her hips swaying to a song only she could hear, turning the museum-like space into a living, breathing home. She was searing meat when the heavy vibration of the front door announced Seojin's return. He stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his face a mask of iron discipline. He watched her for a long moment, his sharp eyes tracking the steam as it rose to the pristine ceiling, and the way Thandeka didn't flinch at his shadow. The quiet storm had met a warm front, and the air between them crackled with the sudden change in pressure. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, yet underscored by a flicker of genuine confusion. "Making this place smell like life," Thandeka replied, not turning around as she stirred the pot. "You have enough marble and glass, Seojin. You need something you can taste." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming the small space. He didn't stop until he was standing directly behind her, close enough for Thandeka to feel the radiating heat of his body. He looked over her shoulder at the vibrant colors in the pan, his jaw tightening. For a man who lived on restraint and cold calculations, the sensory assault of her cooking was a variable he couldn't control. "I didn't give you permission to use the kitchen," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her neck. "Then punish me," she challenged, finally turning to face him. She held his gaze, her eyes reflecting the fire from the stove, refusing to play the role of the broken substitute. She held out a wooden spoon, offering him a taste of the bold, spicy sauce. For a heartbeat, the Mafia boss hesitated, his terrifying discipline warring with a sudden human curiosity. He took the spoon from her hand, his fingers brushing hers, and as he tasted the heat of her world, the ice in his eyes didn't just crack, it began to melt. The penthouse was a tomb of glass, until the steam from the shower began to blur the edges of the master suite. Thandeka had entered the room to retrieve the empty tea tray she had left earlier, but the sight that met her at the threshold anchored her feet to the cold floor. Seojin stood with his back to her, his shirt discarded, the harsh light of the vanity catching the rippling muscles of a body built for war. But it was the ink that stole her breath. A massive, intricate tattoo spanned the entirety of his back, a dense tapestry of traditional Korean imagery, dragon scales, and sharp geometric lines that looked less like art and more like a brand. As she moved closer, driven by a curiosity that outweighed her fear, she realized the tattoo was a map of bloodlines and debts. Every swirl of ink marked a choice made instead of mercy, a record of loyalty to a syndicate that demanded his soul in exchange for his crown. It was a heavy, permanent burden, etched into the skin of a man who was as much a prisoner of his heritage as she was of his bed. The quiet storm was not just a personality, it was a cage. Seojin stiffened, sensing her presence, but he did not turn. The silence between them was no longer the empty quiet of the high-rise. It was thick with the weight of shared secrets. Thandeka reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ink, before she gathered the courage to touch. Her skin, warm and dark, looked vibrant against the pale, marked landscape of his back. When she finally pressed her palm against the center of the design, she felt his heart thrumming beneath the muscle, fast, erratic, and undeniably human. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, her voice a soft South African lilt that seemed to vibrate against his skin. "I did it to myself," he replied, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. "Every line is a debt I cannot repay." In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. He was no longer just the Mafia boss who had purchased her. He was a man struggling under the gravity of his own empire. Thandeka didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her forehead resting against his shoulder blade, acknowledging that they were both merchandise in different markets. The forced intimacy of the room dissolved into a rare moment of understanding. Two broken people, recognizing the chains they both wore. The transition from the private sanctuary of the penthouse to the predatory glitz of the Seoul underground, was a cold shock to the senses. Thandika stood before a mirror, her body poured into a gown of midnight silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, a stark contrast to the sharp, military precision of the tuxedo Seo-jin wore as he stood behind her. Tonight, she was no longer the defiant woman cooking spices in his kitchen. She was the chairman's prize, a silent testament to his reach and his power. As Seo-jin draped a necklace of heavy diamonds around her throat, his fingers lingered against her skin, a brief, burning touch that signaled the start of the performance. The gala was a sea of sharp suits and sharper smiles, held in a ballroom that felt more like a courtroom. Every gaze that landed on Thandeka was calculating, weighing her worth and searching for the weakness that had led a man as disciplined as Seo-jin to choose her. She felt the heavy pressure of his hand on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that both anchored and branded her. Following the proper bow she had practiced in the car, she moved through the crowd with a mask of elegant submission, her eyes downcast, but her mind racing. While she played the part of the perfect, quiet companion, Thandeka's ears remained sharp, filtering the rapid Korean for names and locations that might help secure her sister's final escape. She was a spy in a silk-lined cage, using her visibility to remain invisible. Beside her, Seo-jin was a quiet storm, his silence forcing the other syndicate leaders into a state of visible panic. The tension peaked when a rival chairman approached, his eyes raking over Thandeka with a disgusting familiarity. He spoke a low, mocking comment in Korean, his hand reaching out to touch the fabric of her dress. Before he could make contact, Seo-jin's hand caught the man's wrist in a grip of iron. The air in the ballroom curdled. Seo-jin didn't raise his voice, but the leash he kept wrapped around himself frayed for a terrifying second. In that heartbeat of public defense, Thandeka realized that she was no longer just a substitute in a bed. She was the one thing the Mafia boss couldn't afford to lose. The aftermath of the gala left the penthouse colder than the winter air outside. Seo-jin's protection in the ballroom had been a crack in his armor, and now he was intent on welding it shut with gold. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back turned to Thandeka, as he stared at the neon veins of Seoul. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer a quiet storm. It was ice. "Your sister is safe. She is in a secure location in Johannesburg, and the debt is erased in full," he said, tossing a thick envelope and a first-class plane ticket onto the marble coffee table. The slap of the paper against the stone echoed like a gunshot. "You have played your part well. You are free to go." Thandeka stared at the ticket, but she didn't move to take it. The martyrdom that had brought her here felt heavy, but the sting of being discarded felt heavier. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the floor, until she was standing in the center of his sterile world. "Is this how you regain control, Seo-jin? By paying off the person who made you feel something?" He turned then, his eyes dark and hollow. "You were a transaction," he snapped, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the lie. "I do not want a woman who looks at my back and sees a human instead of a chairman. I want my house silent again." "You're lying," she whispered, stepping into his space until she could see the frantic pulse in his neck. "You're terrified that if I stay, you won't be able to go back to being a weapon." Seo-jin's restraint finally fractured. He grabbed her wrists, his grip desperate rather than cruel, pulling her flush against his chest. I cannot protect you from what I am, he growled, his forehead dropping against hers. If you don't take that ticket, you aren't just a substitute anymore. You become the only weakness I have. Thandeka didn't flinch. She leaned into the heat of him, refusing to let him buy his way back into isolation. Then stop trying to buy me, she breathed, and start trying to keep me. The fracture between them was still raw when the shadows of Seojin's world finally lunged. Thandeka had been standing on the balcony, the first-class ticket still sitting on the marble table, like a discarded skin, when the silent efficiency of the high-rise was breached. It wasn't a loud intrusion. It was a sudden, clinical darkness. Before she could scream, a gloved hand silenced her, and the warmth of her South African resolve was dragged into the freezing night. When Seojin returned to find the penthouse empty and the first-class ticket fluttering on the floor, the quiet storm finally broke. He didn't panic. He transformed into a weapon of singular purpose. The discipline he had cultivated for 27 years didn't disappear. It sharpened into a lethal edge. He bypassed his generals, descending into the belly of the city alone, his back marked with the map of his loyalties, taut with a new kind of debt. In a derelict warehouse by the Han River, Thandeka was held as bait, her sapphire dress torn, but her gaze still a defiant fire. The rival chairman who had mocked her at the gala stood over her, savoring the moment he thought he had found Seojin's weakness. He expected a negotiator. He received a massacre. Seojin moved through the shadows like a ghost of vengeance, his restraint discarded in favor of a terrifying, protective violence. When he finally reached her, stepping over the wreckage of his enemies, his eyes weren't those of a chairman, but of a man who had stared into the abyss of losing the only person who had ever truly seen him. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply gathered her into his arms, his heart thudding against her shoulder with a frantic human rhythm that no amount of ink could hide. He had gone to war for a substitute, and in the process, he had finally realized she was the only victory that mattered. The silence that reclaimed the penthouse after the violence of the Han River was different than the one that had greeted Thandeka on her first night. It was no longer the sterile quiet of a mausoleum, but a heavy, expectant stillness. Thandeka sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, her fingers tracing the jagged silk of her torn dress, while Seojin stood by the window. The first-class ticket to Johannesburg still lay on the marble table, a crumpled testament to a debt that had been erased in blood and fire. "The jet is ready," Seojin said, his voice stripped of its usual iron authority. He did not turn to face her, his shoulders rigid under the weight of his ink and his crown. "Lindui is safe. You have fulfilled your sacrifice. There is nothing left to bind you to this cage." Thandeka stood, her movements steady, despite the exhaustion deep in her bones. She walked toward him, not stopping until she was close enough to see the exhaustion mirrored in his own eyes. The quiet storm was weary, his terrifying discipline finally eclipsed by the raw truth of his own heart. She reached out, her warm hand covering the cold marble of the windowsill next to his. "I didn't stay for the debt, Seojin," she whispered, her South African lilt a soft contrast to the hum of the city below. "I stayed because I saw the man beneath the map. You think you bought a substitute, but you found someone who refuses to leave you in the dark." Seojin finally turned, his gaze searching hers with a vulnerability that would have destroyed his reputation had anyone else seen it. I am a weapon, Thandika. To stay is to live in the shadow of war. Then let me be your son, she replied, her hand moving from the marble to his cheek. I am not a martyr any more. I am a woman making a choice, and I choose to see what we can build when the price has already been paid. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his forehead resting against hers, as he finally let go of the leash. The debt was settled, the sister was safe, and the cage was open. But as Seojin's arms wrapped around her, pulling her into a future they would define together, Thandika knew she wasn't a prisoner. She was home,